welcome back for the final session of what's just been an incredible day. And this is the 4th annual FDA Chiefs Chat at the UCSF-Stanford CERSI Summit. And it's such a privilege for me as the moderator to have just 4 amazing panelists. And I think that each of these panelists could keep all of you wrapped for the entire hour in and of themselves. So we have to be careful how we allocate time. And I was thinking, actually, we could have, unfortunately, Peggy Hamburg, who was going to join us, she just couldn't for last-minute conflicts, personal conflicts. But we could have had Josh here because he was a deputy. He was an acting commissioner for quite some time. But then after that debate performance, I think it's probably safer for each of the 4 of you that he's not actually here. And then I think that Janet, Rob, Scott, each of you have had formal introductions over the course of the day. And Mark, I know that you moderated a debate, but no one introduced you. So if I may introduce Mark McClellan, who served as the FDA Commissioner from 2002 to 2004 and CMS Administrator from 2004 to 2006 under President George W. Bush. Mark was the first individual with a background in both medicine and economics to hold the FDA position. After his government service, he became a senior fellow at Brookings and now leads the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. As a physician economist, his work focuses on healthcare quality, value, payment reform, real-world evidence, and drug and device innovation. So welcome, Mark, and welcome all commissioners. And I'll after the last conversation and your comments, Rob, I'll just acknowledge that we have 3 free individuals and 1 incarcerated individual. So, but I hope that each of you will be more than willing to share your open thoughts as we open this up. So we have a lot that we can discuss. It's an incredibly dynamic moment. There's a lot that's about to, that's coming for the better, for the worse, we'll see. But I'd like to start, and Rob, I'm going to start with you, and then, of course, all of the other esteemed members of the panel can comment as well, with the following question. So based on your experience, what key considerations or guidance would you offer to the incoming FDA commissioner to ensure the agency's continued success? So, Rob.
Well, I mean, I've opined about this publicly before, but in brief, I would say, to me, the number 1 issue is to respect the extraordinary depth of knowledge and understanding there is within the FDA workforce and their interest in trying to make things better. So if you're looking for change, start by getting the workforce on board. And I would just point to the foods program that we just discussed and also the tobacco program recently, where major improvements were made with a lot of hard work by hundreds of FDA employees who really wanted to make things better. The second thing is focus on evidence and be relentless in the focus on evidence, because it is the thing that makes things different about FDA and most other parts of our society. A lot of people have made the point recently that facts are rare and expensive. And because most of what we do in society is based on somebody's opinion, there are major parts of FDA where you gotta, in God we trust, all others must bring data. And our ability to analyze data independently at FDA is a huge asset. I think the rest of it will just be a matter of learning. It will happen that you'll learn. The discussions that we've had today about the ecosystem in which the FDA resides is generally underappreciated. That is, there are a lot of things that all of us would like the FDA to do or not do if the FDA were king or queen. But it's not. What the FDA does is bounded by laws. Because of recent court decisions, it's even more bounded by laws than it ever was before. And so, but I think people will learn when they go and try to change something and then they realize that things aren't changing. You'll pretty rapidly see the reasons for that, and slogans will not fix it. I'll finish with that.
And any of the other commissioners with advice for the incoming?
Look, I think a lot of things, but I would say the one that that I would really try to impress upon folks and have is that if you want to implement major reform inside the agency, the ideas really need to come from the centers. You know, I think the idea of working with the center directors, you can articulate a vision for what you want to achieve and work with the center directors to try to create and implement policy that helps align with those objectives. And that's, in fact, I think what we tried to do, what Mark tried to do. I think it's what Rob tried to do. But the idea that you're going to come in and come in with a whole set of policy ideas, things that might have been formulated downtown, and try to implement it through a top-down approach, you might be able to do that once or twice, but you can't repeatedly do that. You have to work through the center directors. Things have to be organic and work up through the agency. Otherwise, you're going to implement things that either aren't going to be successful or aren't going to have any durability in the long run.
And just to add a bit to that, I mean, look, this was an important election, and the new administration and its leadership want to do some things differently. To pick up on Scott's comments, the best way to undertake some major and visible changes is to build on science-based opportunities and infrastructure that with leadership can help support all of that. So whether it's, Marty is he's a thoughtful person. He's articulated a lot of his views. I know he has a lot of respect for science, and also, though, wants to have more of, for example, public engagement around evidence that may not be ideal. And Janet's done a ton of work on, was it SCTs? Are we going to get that censored out here? A lot of evidence that's generated is not that definitive. Trials that may show an impact in certain populations and certain settings may not be as applicable in other settings or as other treatments come along. The good news is, thanks to a lot of work that FDA staff have done in collaboration with researchers, programs like CERSI and industry, we have a lot more evidence capacity than we used to have. 2 days after the election, we sponsored, as part of our collaboration with FDA, review of the last year of the Sentinel Initiative, including programs at CDRH on device evidence using real-world data, and the BEST program at CBER. And those programs are providing a tremendous amount of information to augment traditional clinical trials and hopefully to do more. I know, Rob, this was a big issue for you as well. So it does seem like there is much more opportunity than ever before to be transparent, engage the public on evidence and data that could be relevant to questions about safety and effectiveness that people have. So my hope is that there will be opportunities to build on that, but the fact of the matter is there is going to also be some new leadership at the agency. There's center director turnover, and in several of the centers below that level, there's still a lot of experienced staff who are involved in many of these kinds of initiatives. So I just think there is, to kind of agree with Scott, I think there are some real opportunities for transformation and leveraging goals that fit with the election and some of the incoming priorities that hopefully can translate into impact.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that quickly. I think if you want to implement policy change in the organization, you have to go through a very deliberate process, a rulemaking process, and you have to develop a very pristine administrative record to justify what you're doing. And that takes time. You can articulate those goals at the outset, but you're engaging in probably a multi-year policymaking process to implement significant change to the review process or other aspects of the agency. And if you want to repeal regulations, you also have to go through a deliberate process and develop an administrative record and issue a new regulation to repeal regulation. I remember one of the regulations we repealed, Janet, you'll remember this, was the one about requiring generic drug manufacturers to put safety information on the labels, which would have led to cluttered labels. It would have raised generic drug costs. It would have opened up the generic manufacturers to failure to warn cases. There were a lot of public health reasons why that regulation, we thought it was unsound, but we went through a long process. I think it took us more than a year to, and I think that was just a proposed rule at the time. And in a post-Chevron world, notwithstanding the fact that I agree with what Peter said. The agency didn't rely on Chevron deference. We never argued in any preamble to any regulation when I was there an argument based on Chevron deference. We would argue it in court when we went into court, but we never leaned on it. We always leaned, when we promulgated regulations and in the preamble to regs, we always leaned on the statute. But in a post-Chevron world, if the agency doesn't develop a strong administrative record to justify its policy actions, it's going to be challenged. There's always someone to sue you at FDA. That's the one thing I learned. And you're going to end up in court, and you're going to end up losing those cases. And if you look at, during my tenure, we didn't lose in court, except around some tobacco cases where we knew we were taking legal risk, and there were very specific reasons why we did that. But HHS did lose in court a lot. You have to go through a careful process around the policy making, and it does take time, and it does take working very closely with the career leadership.
Maybe before you comment, because maybe the question you can add to your comment, Janet. So what I'm hearing is that, what we're hearing is that you're imagining there isn't going to be as much change as many of us believe, because there's, I think, a level of apprehension, certainly on the sponsor side outside of the FDA, that there's so much going on that we're going to see delays, we're going to see disruption, we're going to see changes to how we work together in a way that we haven't historically. So I don't know, Janet, if you were going to offer advice to the incoming commissioner, or if you could also comment on that as well.
Sure. Well, I'm the veteran of probably more administration changes than probably anybody in this room. When I started, Louis Sullivan was the secretary of HHS, and he was a great guy. I really enjoyed that because I could just walk down to HHS and walk in his office and talk science. Times have changed. What I would say is that everybody should take a big step back. That's how I look at things, because I'm kind of a systems person. We have the tremendous changes in science and technology, and the rate of change, we've been talking about that, like AI, the rate of change, but gene editing, all right, molecular design, AI, enabled molecular design, okay, precision medicine, all these things, and they go across, okay, and even the foods, okay, these debates about nutrition, it's because the science of nutrition is starting to come together rather than just eat your fruits and vegetables. And so I think it's step back, and it's always salutary when you start something to look at the big picture. Okay, and what is changing in the environment and what needs to change in response? And to frame it that way rather than some adversarial way, I think is very, very helpful, okay? Because what do we want? What are our objectives? What are the objectives of a new administration coming in? And they shouldn't be just short term, like we want to do this or that, and that's, with all due respect, I've found it often typical that, there's like two things, like I want to do this and that. But I think, and that's fine, because that's probably realistic. Like Scott said, you're not going to do 200 things. But it's good to put those in the context, okay, of what are the changes. And because it's science and legal-based agency, what are science and legal changes, and where's that going, and then where do we have the most leverage to make that go in the direction, and that's where the administration comes in. What direction do we want that to go in, okay, and to then put whatever initiatives you choose, whether they're policy initiatives or procedural or whatever, in the context of what you see as the big picture. And that's the advice I would give, is to take, okay, the election's over, everybody's dust settles and everything. What are we here for? Who are we? What do we stand for? Where do we see the things going, and what leverage, what levers do we want to pull?
Mark, were you going to say something, or? Okay, well, so then it begs the question of what do you predict will be the changes that we're going to see? And actually, one of them that we've talked a lot about, and I'm looking at you, Mark, because I'm going to read a quote that you had in November in Politico. This is about advancing treatment for chronic diseases, which we would all agree is a good thing. And your quote was that Dr. Oz, quote, has shown he can inspire Americans to stay as healthy as possible. He can help inspire CMS to build on its important steps in this direction through coverage and payment reforms that pay for innovative care that works, not just more medical services. So maybe you can comment on chronic diseases, and then others, what do you imagine as some of the changes that could come, good or bad?
And I'll try to bring it back to FDA as well, but I think Dr. Oz is a good example of what Janet and I were just talking about. So fitting with priorities that the incoming administration has highlighted, chronic disease, better nutrition, things like that. Those are areas where CMS historically, with a focus on paying for medical treatments and paying a lot for medical treatments downstream, not that those aren't important, they are, has not paid as much as attention to strong primary care or primary care that involves more engagement with patients and more specialty expertise brought in. We talked earlier a lot today about what AI is making possible in bringing much more support to what have traditionally been primary care physicians or people at home. Well, those are the kinds of things that CMS, pleased to see during this transition, the leadership team is trying, the incoming leadership team is developing and trying to engage on. What would it take to get there? Now, that's not the same thing as success. They still got to get in and execute against a whole bunch of other challenges that you face in these big agencies. Was it, Rob, you came in to, I think, do evidence. You got there for this term at least, and your first job was infant formula crisis. So, that's the way life goes. So I think that kind of approach also applies at FDA, where there's a lot to work with and some good expertise on the staff, some people who could be brought in as advisors who have experience with FDA as well.
First of all, on CMS, I think Oz can be a transformational leader of that organization. I think he's building a very good team. The people who are going into that agency are very experienced, and I think he's going to have a very good team. Look, to Janet's point, when I came into FDA, I articulated a set of areas where I wanted to make policy. One was around tobacco. We talked about trying to advance new innovation. We talked about trying to create competition in the marketplace to improve consumer access. That's where we came up with the Drug Competition Action Plan, which was a lot of policy making around trying to end gaming in the branded industry that prevented generics from entering the market, where Congress had intended for there to be generic competition. I outlined those in my initial speech. I talked to the center directors about it. The ideas that actually formulated those policies, 95% came from the center directors, came from the centers. I mean, I had a few ideas of my own or my immediate staff that we helped contribute, but the ideas really came, the formulation really came from the agency. There was a lot of good work going on around the agency. I think one of the things you try to do as a leader of the organization is find the really good ideas and elevate them and help expedite them because they align with your broader vision. And that's the advice I would give anyone coming in. I think the things around drug competition are still going to be a seductive area of policymaking in this administration. This was something that I routinely briefed the president on. He understood what we were doing. He understood it was creating market competition that was helping to lower prices. And I would expect them to continue to have a focus on that. The other area where you hear a lot of dialogue is around this perception that the hurdles to small companies and venture-backed companies are too high and too costly, and it's too hard to advance products in development. Right or wrong, I expect that to be another area of policymaking. Now, how that actually plays out in the form of policies that you can advance in guidance or regulation, I think that's TBD. I think you could see efforts to try to reform how companies are able to get first-in-man clinical trials, some of the perception of delays around that. I don't know exactly how that would formulate in policy. I think probably there's a lot of people inside the agency right now thinking about that, and hopefully when Marty arrives at the agency, there'll be some good ideas that he can help build on. But I think that there are some clear buckets of policy making or policy focus that I think are identifiable right now. Those would be two that I would point to.
Yeah, I think this is because I've been working on this. I think a new kind of variation, and Rob, you stay in your seat here, huh? On the substantial evidence standard for very rare diseases is something that needs to be done. I believe that too many products 1,000 candidates for rare diseases are being put on the shelf because they don't see a way forward. And I just don't think that's right. And I think that convincing evidence can be generated in multiple different ways. So I would like to nominate that for consideration.
Well, I'll just react to that quickly. I mean, what I'd say about it is I never really quite understood the standard as it has evolved anyway, because if you look at accelerated approval, the actual literal interpretation that it's the same standard is a technical interpretation of substantial evidence for a different outcome, not the outcome that people care about, which is, am I going to live longer or have better function? This does a biomarker change in a way that's reasonably likely to predict that. As a clinical investigator and a clinician, that's not the same standard in common terms. It's a technical interpretation that has been sort of gerrymandered to make it work. And now, so I would just say this whole area of what to do about very rare diseases, there's a lot of research that's needed, because I don't think anybody knows exactly how to run the balance between, as you said, completely discouraging. If you had a disease with 100 people, what would you do? Well, if everybody abandons it, that's terrible. But if you put a bunch of stuff on the market that doesn't work, or 10 years later kills a bunch of people, that's also really bad. And I would just say anyone who says they know exactly what to do right now is delusional. So it needs to change, but exactly how, it sort of gets into what I think all of you have articulated.
I could say a few more things
Please.
about it. Oh,
Please,
thank
you're
you.
very passionate about
Well, I
this.
don't want to hijack anything, but really, okay, so we had 2 adequate and well-controlled trials, okay? The statute says says adequate and well-controlled investigations, including clinical investigations that'll convince experts, okay? That's what the statute said. FDA then spent 20 years establishing that was 2 adequate and well-controlled trials with statistical test p less than 0.05. Okay, fine. Then we had.
But it's 60% of approvals only have one trial now.
I'm not done. Okay, then we got variability. We got variations on that as the science improved. Okay, because back in 62 amendments, we didn't know anything about disease. Then we got accelerated approval, and then the agency started using one. Adequate and well-controlled trials and confirmatory evidence, okay? And then because of life-threatening diseases, you're not going to randomize people to, when you've already showed the drug is life-saving, to a placebo, right? And so then you had, those were both instantiated in the statute, okay? Accelerated approval and their variations. That the point that people say it's the same standard, they're talking about it's a statutory standard of efficacy interpreted in different ways, okay? Yeah, the outcomes, but then we did the animal rule, okay? And their drugs are approved based on animal models, okay? And that's considered that's an approval too, okay? You have to go, if you have an outbreak or something, then you have to go and try to do a trial then. So what I'm saying is that I agree, much more research is needed, but just perseverating on saying you have to do an RCT in a disease that has 100 people and you can probably only recruit 40 for a trial, it's doomed to failure. There's not enough power unless it's, a miracle cure. So then you're stuck. And all these programs, now the science, that's what I mean, the science is moving along, and we have all these programs directed at rare diseases because people have discovered in your laboratories some of the genetic basis of a lot of these diseases, and then generated candidate treatments that they can't move forward. So I'm sorry, I'll stop.
Well, let me ask a question to you, Rob, and maybe kind of continuing on Janet's platform. So here's a thesis that you may or may not believe, but if 100% of drugs that are approved are guaranteed to be efficacious in, say, 5 to 10 years after their approval, then I think many would believe that we're actually raising a bar too high. We're not going to be delivering medicines to patients at the rate that we all need to. And certain subpopulations, the inclusiveness of certain rare diseases would be such that we would rarely develop medicines in those spaces. So with that said, what percentage of medicines do you think over the last 5 years actually won't prove to be efficacious and safe at the level that they would need to be?
Well, first I'll just say knowing that, although it's entirely possible to know, we have a system in the United States which is specifically designed not to find the answer to that question.
Right, that's the
Because
problem ultimately, isn't
It would be an easy
Yeah.
thing in the post-market, given the
Yeah.
ubiquity of electronic health records and other data, to figure out which treatments are effective. And in fact, I was overwhelmed when Israel visited about a year and a half ago, where they've combined essentially the FDA and CMS function into one. And what they told me was, we don't really care about what the cost, what we have to pay for drugs to start out with. We're going to measure whether they work, and we're going to adjudicate the price based on how good they are. It's obvious now we're spending $5 trillion a year on healthcare. It's not all drugs, that always comes up. No, it's not all drugs. But we're using a lot of technology, drugs, devices, that has marginal to no benefit, but we don't know which it is because we don't have a system of generating the evidence. But this is something that Janet said that also relates to what you said, Andy. You can say, well, it's the same standard because it's in the statute or because there's a p-value of whatever. God bless p-values. We're not supposed to use them anymore, but we all do. But what you described in that
by
continuum,
the way, that memo hasn't gotten out.
Yeah.
We're not supposed to use
in that continuum from chronic disease where you have a high standard of large trials still, and I think that's good, to accelerated approval for rare disease, to the animal rule, the amount of uncertainty. We just showed the animal rule that basically it didn't work for monkeypox, right? We were stockpiling a drug that was ineffective.
Right.
And so I don't know what the right number is, but I think the more uncertainty, obviously, the more times you're going to get it wrong. But I can't think of a better system than civil servants who have no financial interests making that decision based on the data that's submitted. And that is one thing for the next administration. Crossing that line of civil servants making that decision, I think that would be a piece of advice I would give. Don't cross that line, because then you have no idea where to stop.
Yeah. Did you want to rebut quickly, Janet? Or?
I don't disagree with Rob. I would simply say that a lot of the drugs, here we have the rare diseases, these often are dying children. Okay, a lot of the drugs that we've approved, and you even said it yourself, maybe they don't have very much value. Okay, you could have a 10% treatment effect. Okay, 90% of the people in the treatment arm didn't benefit. But you approve it, you do a large enough trial, it's safe and effective.
But if the outcome is death, it's affecting 1 million people,
well,
that's a lot
really
of lives
important.
saved.
What if the outcome is relief your headache? Most of them are symptomatic treatments.
Then it's
Safe and effective.
safe and effective.
All right, so let's move on. That was great. So we're going to go back a bit to a lot of what we've been hearing over the past couple of months in terms of what's coming, and talk a little bit about improving internal efficiency and bureaucratic processes at the FDA, which I think everybody agrees with. The question is how, and I'm looking at you, Scott, in some respects, because when you were commissioner, there was a lot that you did, pulling the right levers to really drive those efficiencies. And actually, I wanted to, Rob, quote you from a January 8th stat article that was fantastic. Now, you said this on reorganization of the food division, but it probably applies to everything within FDA. And the quote is, "We had very good people who just couldn't get done what they needed to get done because of the way the thing was structured. As a result, the FDA collapsed its food division from a confusing warren of offices into a single organizational structure, something I'm proud of as perhaps the proudest accomplishment of my tenure." So about efficiency. So now we have this other large organization. I when it first came out, I pronounced it doggy, but I think it's pronounced Doge. So maybe, Scott, you want your comments about some of your approach versus what you're seeing coming out of the ideas from Doge.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to understand what Doge is actually going to be. Right now they've hired 50 staff. They're working out of SpaceX. Right now it's operating almost as an external think tank. I think that the more that they start to operate as an agency, and certainly if they operate as a department, they're going to be subject to a lot of oversight and requirements that I suspect they want to actively avoid. They don't want to be FACA compliant. They don't want to have to be subject to the disclosure rules. They don't want to have to be subject to the divestiture rules. And so that's going to make it hard for them to figure out, and this is my assumption.
Did you say that Rob Ramaswamy and Musk don't want to be subject to divestiture? I can't imagine.
This is my assumption. They haven't publicly articulated this. I haven't had discussions around this, but this is my assumption that they're not going to want to be subject to a lot of those rules. And a lot of those rules obviously create legal liability as well under different federal statute. And so to the extent that you can argue they've done everything wrong so far. They named it a department. They've talked about it as an agency. So you've created already a record where you're envisioning this operating like a department, and then you're going to turn around and say you don't want to operate like a department. And so the question becomes, well, how could you operate as sort of an external advisory body, not subject to FACA, making recommendations that the agency heads feel compelled in some way to have to take up, but you don't have direct policy-making authority. And I think where you might see them settle out, and this again is just my conjecture, is around regulatory reform. And then the question becomes, is that going to be a very deliberate process, or is it going to feel like a lot of picking and choosing where there's some uncertainty about where their focus is going to fall because they haven't really articulated a very clear vision for how they're going to reform regulation and what areas they're going to focus on. And there is some risk that it lapses into the latter, where it's sort of you wake up and you look on Twitter and you find out which of your regulatory prerogatives or which regulation is being targeted. In some ways there was some uncertainty like this in the first Trump administration. I remember when I first was confirmed, before I'd even started, someone very senior said to me, this is going to be a great administration to work in. You're going to have a lot of autonomy as an agency head. You're just going to have to tolerate a ceremonial firing every now and then. And there was some truth to that, where you woke up every morning, the first thing I did was check Twitter, both to make sure I still had a job, but also to see if I was scoped into a tweet that day. And I remember one morning I woke up and there was the president had tweeted about a merger between two communications companies that he was aghast at. And I knew it was something that had been blessed by the FCC, and Ajit Pai, who was my friend, who was the FCC commissioner, had signed off on. So I texted him and I said, Ajit, really sorry, I'm sorry to see this happen to you. Is there anything I can do to be helpful? Is there anyone I can call to try to, sort of lobby on your behalf? And he goes, oh no, don't worry about it. They didn't realize I was responsible for it, so it's okay. I smoothed it out. And so, it's a long way to say I can envision a similar scenario where you start to see pronouncements around certain regulations that if they don't go through a very deliberate process, you're not working closely with the agency heads, it could be as disruptive as it can be helpful. And so that would be my advice to them, is work in a more coordinated fashion, focus on areas of regulation. One of the things that we tried to focus on when I was at FDA, tried to reform, was standards of identity. There's a recipe for everything we consume, like ketchup. The FDA says what has to be in ketchup or what has to be in mayonnaise for it to be called ketchup or for it to be called mayonnaise. And it makes a lot of sense why you'd want a standard set of requirements before something could be labeled as ketchup. But the rules are so prescriptive and they're so embedded in sort of stone because they're codified in regulation that they become very hard to change, and it's hard to innovate these food ingredients. That could be an area where I could see a lot of regulatory reform that would create more competition in the market, help lower costs, allow people to innovate in food products. And so if I was in DOGE looking to try to reform regulation, I would look for areas of regulation like that rather than one-off regulations to try to reform sort of whole spheres, if you will.
Yeah, but just as an unrelated tangent, as a consumer, what if we're in a situation in a restaurant, for example, and we have French fries and we dip them into what's called ketchup, and it's clearly not ketchup? What is our recourse?
Well, there's a standard of identity for milk, and it specifically says that it has to come from a lactating animal, which I unfortunately quoted at a congressional hearing, which got me on the Colbert Show, but that's another story.
That quote is mine, though. I could have sworn I heard Gottlieb recommended that Ramaswamy and Musk should divest. I think that is a brilliant recommendation.
That wasn't specifically what I said, but.
Mark?
It's hard to top that, but I will say on this point about, look, this is a new kind of Republican administration, but I think it's pretty clear that there is an intent to lower costs in government and costs caused by government. There's not that much money you can save directly in FDA, thinking about in comparison to my other former agency where CMS, I think there will be some DOGE influence steps to try to bring down costs without cutting Medicare benefits, and while pursuing that agenda around prevention and more efficient and more affordable health care. But here, it is going to take some effort to figure out where are those real regulatory opportunities. I think there are some I mentioned earlier around using available post-market evidence resources better. And I don't want to get in between Janet and Rob's debate there, but there are a lot of questions about, treatments get approved, but if we don't figure out how to get them to the people who can most benefit and learn a lot about how to improve adherence, and it's not just a matter of lowering the out-of-pocket costs, important as that is, it's a matter of having supporting systems too. So I think there's a lot to learn there. I don't know, Scott, if that's FDA or CMS responsibility to influence, but I'm not going to get involved in that debate, the previous debate either. But those may be some opportunities to really leverage post-market evidence systems more effectively. And aside from rare diseases, I'd also put out a call in gene therapies and cellular therapies, where right now it's still really complicated to get those treatments approved with sufficient evidence. They're going to have a path to significant access. And there are a lot of good ideas that some of the CERSI programs have been working on. We've been working on with our colleagues at Duke, that CBER under Peter's leadership have worked on for bringing down the cost, the uncertainty, the time for developing the treatments themselves and for manufacturing them reliably and for doing post-market studies that could align at least with payment and access. So those seem like good opportunities, but it is going to be a challenge to get from the overall goal to big impact.
Yeah, look, I don't know that it's going to be a significant challenge depending on how you try to go about regulatory reform. We've clearly heard an articulation in the political context of a perception that we want to foster innovation, that the cost of innovation is too high, that small companies and individual investigators are sort of locked out of the regulatory process because of the high costs of getting into clinical trials. I think there's still a lot of refrain around drug costs and trying to create competition, as I said before. I think if you come in and sort of articulate these broad goals, which I think is wholly appropriate for a political leader of the organization to say, look, I want to try to advance policies that are going to help promote breakthrough innovation and help lower the cost of getting innovation into development so that we see more opportunities for investigators. There's a lot of activity already underway at FDA. And what you try to do is start to sort of encapsulate that activity and fashion it into a broader set of policies, into action plans and larger policies where the agency can take credit for trying to advance an agenda around a certain sphere of policymaking. You heard Peter talk about some of the reforms he's looking at ways to try to get gene therapy constructs approved based on organ type rather than the clinical indication, where you can get approval for a gene therapy construct that would make a modification in the liver, and then once you have that base approval, then filing the equivalent of sort of a supplement, if you will, or almost special controls from a medical device context for each individual therapeutic application. That's something that he's talking about and working on. That's a perfect example of a policy that if you're coming in and you want to help foster innovation in that area, you elevate that. And I think the professional staff appreciates that because they want to advance these goals. And if you're willing to go in and put some of your capital behind it and your effort to get that over the finish line, you're going to get a lot of alignment in the organization.
Yeah, I really agree with you, Scott. I think that, and that's what I mean by the science and technology changing. It isn't really a political matter. It's the fact that the science has changed, and what we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, isn't fit for purpose for some of the new technologies, and we need to evolve. And the agency does keep evolving, but helping that evolution and picking areas where it really needs to be brought forward, and there need to be new paradigms, I think is something that a new administration can really do and be helpful in making that happen. And it's not bad, and it's not like us versus them or whatever. The traditionalists, this has been my experience, people they don't like change. The first thing they think is, I'm going to lose my job. The next thing they think is, I'm going to lose my parking space, or at least that was true before the pandemic, right? And so and people think if you want to do something new, that's what was done in the past was bad. And that's not true, okay? What we need to do is different because the present is different than the past.
Yeah.
So I think those are lessons that are really important. There has to be change. We have to do change because things are changing. And so seize the day. That'd be my advice, yeah.
Excellent. You really are out of jail, aren't you? This is great. You're so disinhibited. You've been on this panel for multiple years, but you're going for it. It's great,
Wasn't
Janet.
I always like
You
this?
you were always a little, careful. But it's great. So so
I haven't heard anything I didn't hear before, so.
so let's talk about all the departures that we're hearing and morale within the agency, because firstly, we've been hearing about poor agency morale for many years, overworked, the pandemic, new ways of working. Now we're seeing a lot of negativity coming in from the administration around and letting people go in ways that are ceremonial, perhaps, or not. And here's a quote from that aforementioned stat article from you again, Rob. You said, quote, "We're seeing an increase in early retirements and loss of good people, so I'm worried about it." So how concerning is this? Is this part of the natural transition? Is it a little bit more than usual because we are in a period of change, or is this really, really concerning?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, if you got hired into your next R&D leader job and the first thing you said was pack your bags and preserve your records, how do you think your staff that you're coming into would
That line
react
is
to that?
not one I would use as a leader.
Okay. So with those kind of pronouncements, I am worried. And we've known for a long time that there were a lot of people at FDA who could retire, and they were staying on for a whole variety of reasons. I'll also say, and I've said this publicly many times, I felt like the turnover rate at FDA is actually too low, not too high. I spent a lot of time in both of my regimes getting the data, and job satisfaction at FDA has been pretty good. If you look at, we're better than everything except for NASA, which always, leads the way in federal agencies. So, in these circumstances, we're seeing a higher rate of retirement. Some of those people, it was time for them to leave anyway, and people get stale in the job, et cetera, but some of them are really critical reservoirs of information that other people might not necessarily have. So we'll just have to see. I think this is fixable. We're only a week away. And I think a lot depends on what the attitude is of the people coming in. If they do what Janet and Scott and Mark have said and say, here are the things our objectives, can you help us do it? They'll get a very positive response.
Yeah, if I just may add to what Rob said, the people at FDA are totally dedicated to the mission. The federal government does surveys, and they used to, a long time ago, they did them norm to the outside, but now it's just norm to the federal government. Like Rob said, the FDA comes in extremely high on the dedication, the mission, the belief making a difference, all these things. So these are people who are passionately committed to what they're doing. And so in that sense, morale is very good. Okay. If they're told, though, in the other sense, though, if you're told what you're doing isn't worth anything and everything, then that's going to have a very negative impact because, there's this very strong belief in the public health mission of the agency across all the agency staff. They're very proud and committed to what they do.
Yeah, I would just pick up on that. I tried to be very deliberate about trying to relate how the policy goals that I wanted to work on and I wanted the agency to help champion were part of the agency's mission, were important to advancing that public health mission. And I think when things were framed in that context and when people believed it, they were very supportive. And I think a lot of the goals that we set out, I think a lot of the goals that have been articulated already from the incoming administration could be related back to sort of the public health bottom line of what the agency does and how people there see their mission. I think in terms of high-level departures, before I landed at the agency, I had reached out to all the center directors and some of the other senior career leaders and met with them. You're told not to when you're an incoming nominee, but I felt it was important to do that to both reassure them about how I would try to govern and also reassure them that I didn't want them to leave. And there were people who were thinking of leaving at the time who I asked them to give me the benefit of the doubt, and they did, and they stayed, and I think it worked out well. It is extremely disruptive to have turnover at the senior career leadership in that organization, and particularly at the center director level. There is a very steep learning curve to someone coming into that role. I think the idea of hiring someone from the outside to assume the role of center director is more often than not going to be doomed to failure. I think those roles should be drawn from people who are within the organization. There's a very unique culture to the organization, a very unique way of doing things, a steep learning curve, and I think it's very hard for someone coming in from the outside to run one of those centers, have the credibility within the organization that they're going to need, not coming out of that culture. And, I think that there is a view among some, I'm not saying the people who are, coming into these jobs or anyone who's around us, but there is a view out there that the way to really shake things up and be disruptive is to go out and recruit new leadership into some of these roles, and that it's somehow going to be different. And my view is it's going to be 2 years of inefficient policymaking, not being able to advance your agenda. So I think that would be something I would advise folks about, FDA in particular, where I think it's hard to recruit from the outside.
Can I ask you, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can I ask a question just to help educate us? Who is it that makes the decision on a division director? Is it the FDA? Is it the FDA chief? Who is it?
Ultimately, it's the FDA chief. I mean, when we, for example,
is there a congressional process at all? Or
no, it's the FDA decision. I mean, when Janet stepped down and Patrizia took the role, that decision, Janet could speak to it, was largely made by Janet and CEDAR with my support. I deferred to her judgment around who should run CEDAR, and I knew Patrizia well. I had worked with her. I felt very confident and comfortable with her taking that role. We were pretty focused on keeping that decision within FDA and not allowing that to become a decision that got made at HHS or at another level. And there was interest in other people being involved in that decision, but they were not. And I think Alex Azar, to his credit as the secretary of HHS at the time, recognized also the importance of independence in the agency around those decisions. One of the things I worry about is that if they did away with the flexible work arrangements that FDA has in place, I think that could cause a real exodus of people from FDA. And you have to remember, these flexible arrangements go back 20 years. These are not a post-COVID phenomena. Mark was there when we made the decision. I was just a senior advisor to him. But it was Mark's decision with Janet to put in place arrangements where people were allowed to flex their hours when we moved the campus from Rockville to White Oak, recognizing that people would be reverse commuting. We were worried there would be a lot of departures from the agency because of the new burdens that would be imposed on people. And there was also a recognition, and Janet could speak to this better, but a lot of the work of reviewing an application is sort of solitary work. Whether you're sitting in your office at White Oak or you're sitting at home in your home office, you're doing the same activity. So do you really need to be physically at FDA? But whether you agree with that or not, that has been the policy for 20 years. You had a whole generation of people who've been hired into the agency based on this expectation, who've modified their lives around it, maybe chose to work at FDA, left clinical practice and chose to work at FDA because of the accommodations that they could have at the agency. If you suddenly were to reverse that, you would see an exodus from the agency. And it might not be the people who folks would say, well, we can do without them. It would be a lot of the people who have the best opportunities on the outside.
That's always the case. Mark?
On the sort of the short term, I do think there will be some steps towards bringing federal workers back into the office associated with DOGE and the incoming policy priorities. But to Scott's point, how that's implemented matters. We've seen lots of organizations, most pharma companies, our academic institution, et cetera, that are bringing people back in the office more, but it's kind of a new balance reflecting the realities of how do you do the job most efficiently. And these flexibilities have been there for a couple of decades because FDA has a hard time competing with outside job offers. I know Janet wants to say something about this, but I also just the reality is that there are going to be new center directors. I mean, that's just, it's the way things have timed out. Patrizia, I think, did a terrific job, but it's, that's a tough job, and she's been there for a while. We've had FDA's had a recent reorganization of the food programs that could be built on. Lots of interesting things, important things going on in devices, like we've talked about. This is about the most I think I've ever seen at this CERSI meeting, focusing on CDRH, and that's AI driven, I think in part, and appropriately so. To that point, if it's possible to either bring up people who are on the career staff. So, for example, at Cedar, I think they're permanent people in every, right, Rob, deputy position right now, many of whom have some great experience. I understand Jacqueline's going to be acting there. So there's a lot of talent pool to build on, support someone who comes in, or to maybe help advance like Scott did, or if someone's coming in from outside, someone who has some FDA experience as well. But I remember my first meeting with Janet, where I think you came into my office, but I kind of felt like you were sitting me down and explaining. I came in with like, here are some priorities that I have in mind, efficient risk management and so forth, and she schooled me on how you could actually do these more effectively. So efficient risk management eventually turned into a critical path program, and I could go on down the list. So there are some real opportunities here. I think there will be some challenges. There always are with big transitions, and that is going to happen. But there are some real opportunities here too.
Just a very practical point. I mean, FDA doesn't have enough room to bring people in full-time. One of the reasons we were doing like 2 days a week off or 3 days a week off, 2 in, before the pandemic.
Not days off, right? Working, but working from
work,
home. Yeah,
off
okay.
Off of
Just
White Oak.
correcting misperceptions that exist about
absolutely.
government workers.
No,
It's already on Twitter. It's too late.
we tracked it, and we got more productivity with people being working from home. But
How
my
did you
point,
measure? How did you measure productivity? That's always a challenge.
Yeah, well, we had all these metrics
All right,
and
all
all
right,
this
go,
stuff.
go.
Metrics.
Yeah, I
mean,
set up
this
all
was-
kind of metrics like
Okay,
during the
good.
pandemic because I knew people would harass us about that. So we measured a lot of things, plus employee satisfaction rose tremendously. Plus we could hire talent remote who wouldn't move in because maybe their spouse was working in LA or something, and we could hire specific talent remotely to work remotely.
By the way, we all have the same experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but my point is, I was having to hire, when I was center director, even with all of this going on, I was hiring senior medical people for internal offices to share. Internal little offices that they had to share because we didn't have enough room at White Oak. So that's a reality. Okay, so you make everyone come back. Where are you going to put them?
Yeah, there are a lot of realities there. I'm really glad that you all brought this up. And I was actually very impressed with the metrics when I came back. It was in the midst of the pandemic. I had just been working at Google, which is pretty well known for its handling of employees, even though they did form a union of people that were averaging $500,000 a year in salary. but still, everything was metricized. And just for fun, I'll mention one thing to get it off my chest. I went to so many hearings where Congress people would put up these stupid posters of the empty parking lots. And so I took pictures of the empty parking lots at the congressional offices because they have a thing called Thursday Flyaway Thursdays. There's nobody there.
That's so funny.
But my staff would not let me show my posters in retaliation.
Maybe when you're free, those can get out. All right, so it's interesting because I think everybody would agree that there's just been so much progress at FDA, and overall, it's an incredibly progressive agency with very bright and dedicated people, with a dialogue that occurs with its stakeholders externally that's very high level. And we don't always agree, but I think that there's a really strong set of confidence. But there's a lot of criticism that's layered on the FDA, and I don't think you realize until the institution feels like it's at risk how much you want to step in to try to protect what you have. So of course we're always interested in doing more to try to make ourselves better, including this important agency. But right now there's a feeling like we need to help. So the question, and you probably have something else to say, which I'll let you say in a second, Rob, but the question is, and perhaps the last question of the panel, what can all of the various contingencies that are here, so including you as pretty soon you as well, Rob, Chief Emeriti, us as wherever we are, whether we're in biotech, whether in pharma, whether we're in academics, because I know, Rob, you've been in the past quite outspoken around what academicians can do to support the FDA, whether we're consultants. What could we do to help in this next step, whether it's in helping efficiency, helping morale, to promote the mission of the agency? What can we all do?
Well, I can let others go first here.
But you had something else you wanted to say, I noticed.
It's,
So
it's
please.
related, so
Okay, so
I'll
go ahead,
say.
yeah. All right.
Well, I guess just I'd say two things. One is one of the things that I think will happen for people who haven't spent time at the agency yet. Once you go there and you really see how much the people of FDA care about the mission and want to make it a success and want to find, there's so limited resources we've talked about and so many opportunities to use new developments in the sciences and new approaches to solving regulatory problems, that there's always something to do. And I think one of the things that this group and people here can hopefully lean in on is what are those positive steps. They're as Scott said, you're going to get sued no matter what you do. You're also got reporters who are going to write about you every day no matter what you do. Your only choice is, what are those things going to be and how much can you drive that? And this is a really important time for the agency, and I hope that the broader expert community, industry, the rest of us here can listen to what the incoming priorities are and find a way, as we've talked about today, to turn those important ideas addressing chronic diseases and the health of Americans and their access to care and the opportunities to improve innovation, the opportunities to address trust and have more transparency around evidence and following up on clinical studies. All of those are great opportunities today, and I hope we can do something positive with them. The last thing, I do want to get this in, so one thing that you're going to have 100% probability of is whatever you think you want to work on and prioritize at FDA, that is not the only or maybe even the main thing you're going to be able to do. There is a 100% chance of some kind of public health emergency, some kind of new challenge out there, whether it's a security issue or something that's going to happen, and you need to build that into your plan as well, and you really need the staff behind you on that. Scott and I did a op-ed, I have to get plug in for that too, in Stat on Friday, highlighting some new opportunities to more efficiently watch and manage emerging public health threats. That's a great example of something you're likely to face, and having some advanced planning is a great way to engage the staff, and if you don't do it beforehand, you're going to have to do it when the emergency hits.
Look, I've known Marty for a long time. I think he's going to be a strong leader. I'm very optimistic about how he's going to perform in the job. He also helped promote my book, so I really like him. I think the way I view Marty is that he's a rigorous scientist who looks closely at data and sometimes formulates a contrarian view. He's not a contrarian who his views are shaped, who sort of shapes his evaluation of the science and the data based on his preconceived positions or preconceived views. And that's a very big difference. I think he's a data-driven guy who looks closely at scientific facts. And I think that's going to serve him very well in the agency. And to the extent that he questions things and he has at times formulated views that I think are contrarian, at least to my views. I guess everything that I don't agree with is contrarian.
By definition.
That's a healthy thing. I think he's been very adept at stimulating discussion, debate where it was appropriate to stimulate discussion, debate, especially during COVID. I think in terms of the industry and the academic community, the thing that I worry most about was what I just talked about, the idea of unwinding the work arrangements that have been put in place at FDA over a very long period of time for very good reasons, and allowing sort of FDA's flexible arrangements to get swept up in this perception that people kind of started working from home during COVID and never went back. And that's a very big difference. And I don't think it's been articulated very clearly why things are different and ought to be different at FDA and what the consequences would be. And that's not a Marty thing. That's the thing that's going to come from OMB and from others who try to implement requirements that people have to go back to the office. They need to recognize that FDA is different in that regard, and if you don't respect that, then you could really, the wheels could come off. You could see very rapid period of departures from the agency that would then potentially push out PDUFA goal dates because the agency wouldn't have the personnel, would have a lot of transition and turnover, and could have a real snowball effect, I think, on product development.
Janet, a last comment, and then Rob, you can take us home.
Yeah, well, I agree with what Scott has said. I think, in general, in my humble opinion, okay, in the past, like the attitude of most groups toward the FDA has been, what have you done for us lately? And this, including the industry, you know, this long laundry list of things that you could improve, and that's a natural human thing, like, okay, fine. And I do the same thing. I'm a born critic. Okay, we can improve this, we can improve that. So I think now is a time to kind of lay off that and really sort of consolidate the gains. And as people have said, think about what are the opportunities and cast this in a very positive light. So I think that's really important.
Thank you. Rob.
Yeah, well, you asked what should the community do to help the FDA at this point. I would say two things. One, there are certain things which I would regard as a bright line, and I mentioned the one that I think is most important, which is not having political interference in individual product decisions. There is a myth that and I thought the debate today highlighted some, there's a myth that all of FDA should not be political, but in fact, rulemaking and guidance is they're political by design. You have to get, I presume everybody here knows what OIRA is. I always ask this question. Most people don't. Most places I go, no one knows what it is, but nothing gets through
What was it?
It's a part of the Office of Management and Budget, whose job is to represent the executive branch of the government in adjudicating all the potential differences and costs across the whole of the federal government. So we have several things right now that are sitting in OIRA waiting to get out, and some have been there a long time.
I never taught Rob how to keep your things away from OIRA. There's a way to do that, Rob.
And sometimes those things get through at the end of an administration.
Well, we did just put out 28 guidances. That's another story.
Well, it'll be on a...
So that's point number one, is the bright lines. And I think if the bright lines are broken and the community does not react in force, it could be a real spiral of bad things that could happen that most people in this room, I think, would consider horrible. And then the second thing is, it's what I alluded to when I asked Janet the question about the food stuff. I think on the sort of people who really believe in the key parts of federal institutions, that they're important, there's been this attitude that they're always going to be there. And so your best way to get what you need is to just criticize the hell out of them. And you'll get a little bit of what you want. And I understand that strategy, but what that does to the rest of the public is it makes people believe that our best defenders actually think we're terrible. And that gives leeway to people in public policy to get away with statements that are very dangerous. Now, as we've all, I think, pointed out, a lot of things have been said from people who are coming in the incoming administration, but none of us know what's going to happen until noon on January 20th. And it could turn out to be just a lot of talk, and a lot of really good, interesting things could happen in the way of change, and we have to be ready for that. But we also very much need supporters to come up with a way of civil discourse. How can we have differences of opinion about what should happen without questioning the motives and the beliefs? And I keep laughing about the divestiture. I know you didn't say that. Let me be clear. But come on, we're being told on the one hand the industry should be completely divorced from FDA by people who are nominated to be in charge, and on the other hand, we're being looking at the financial interests of those people They have financial interests that are directly involved, and they're not saying they're going to divest. So these things are not compatible. So we need the community to stand up for the right part and criticize, but figure out a way to have civil differences of opinion without impugning the people who are trying to do the jobs. And it goes the other way. So I think there's a, last thing I'll say, this has been evident at this meeting. It's one of the reasons I like it so much. The former commissioners and acting commissioners have a bond which comes from the practical experience of what you need to do, where the rubber meets the road between the theory and political discourse and what it takes to keep this part of the country running. And so we tend to see things more similarly than different. And I will say that we're always available. Like, I got a lot of help from the former commissioners when, for example, the food reorganization was needed, and it was greatly appreciated.
That's great. Well, with that, let me say, before we open it up to the audience, to thank you, that all of us are greatly appreciative of the sacrifices and the leadership and the commitment that you make to healthcare. So, and we also appreciate every year you're coming to be part of this fantastic panel. So if you could all please join me in a big round of applause. Thank you.